Happy Friday, welcome back to Drinking by My Shelf. My name is Emma, and today I'm going to talk about non-fiction books that I actually liked. If you've been around for a while, you will know that I basically never read non-fiction, and when I do read non-fiction, I usually complain that I found it boring. So I kind of would have said that I never like non-fiction really, but I thought I'd do a video on the few non-fiction books that I've actually really enjoyed, and what surprised me when I went back through my story graph to find them is that there were loads. I could find loads of non-fiction books that I'd given 5 stars to. So what am I even talking about? Maybe I love non-fiction. In no particular order, this is just the order that I wrote them down in. Here are all the non-fiction books that I gave 5 stars to, starting with possibly my favourite of them all, Dear Reader by Cathy Rentzenbrink. I've talked about this one a lot. It was one of my favourite books of 2020. This is a book all about books. It's all about the comfort and joy of reading, and it is just gorgeous. I have a whole reading vlog that I'll link to below where you can see me read this one and completely fall in love with it. I even teared up a little bit at one point. This is basically Cathy Rentzenbrink's memoir told through the books that she was reading at different stages of her life, and I love how completely unsnobby and unpretentious this book is. It's all about reading being for everyone, the joy that anyone can get from books. But something else that I remember loving in this one is that while Cathy Rentzenbrink clearly sees the same magic in books that I do, and that I assume a lot of you do if you're here on this channel, it's because you love reading, she also doesn't assign some kind of innate superiority to reading. So it's not a book that would make you feel put off or left out. If you're someone who never really got into reading, you wouldn't read this and feel like, oh, I'm being looked down on, or I've missed out on this huge part of life. It might just inspire you to want to read a book, but she doesn't try and claim any actual innate magic in books that people who don't read don't get. It's more just about celebrating the comfort and joy that books can bring to your life if you let them. My favourite section was where she went into prisons and kind of introduced reading to people who sometimes hadn't really ever had any access to books or even been taught how to read before, and I found that really moving. I have a thing about prisons. I hate prisons. I hate the prison system. I don't think it's right or fair to treat people that way, and so anything that kind of explores the humanity of prisoners who are being treated in this terrible way always just gets me very emotional, but I really enjoyed that section of the book. So yeah, this was absolutely beautiful in every way. Another really fun non-fiction book is The Adventures of Maud West, Lady Detective by Susannah Stapleton. This is the true story of Maud West, who is this very enigmatic detective in the golden age of detective fiction. She worked in London for about 30 years, the first half of the 20th century, but we don't know that much about her because, as well as being this amazing private detective, she also wrote works of fiction or exaggeration about being a private detective, which would then get published in tabloids. So there's a real mix of stories about her, some of them which cannot possibly be true. One of the things that made this book so fun to read is that it's kind of written like a detective story in itself. So we're following Susannah Stapleton, the author, try and get to the bottom of who Maud West was and really dig into her past. And so we get kind of cliffhangers and reveals at the end of the chapters. I just kept turning the pages. It was so much fun. And it's just ridiculous. So much of it is so silly. All of these pictures on the front here are Maud West in various disguises. She was a master of disguise. I got to meet the author, Susannah Stapleton, for work, for a book break video where she dressed me up in various disguises that Maud West herself had recommended. It's absolutely ridiculous. Might be the most I've ever laughed while trying to film a video for work, and also the stupidest I've ever looked. But you know what? I think the disguise worked. I think I looked pretty different. The Clapback by Lawal is your guide to calling out racist stereotypes. This book essentially breaks down different racist stereotypes that exist in our society and then delves into the history of why they exist in order to disprove them. And so even though a lot of us know that these things are stereotypes and would like to be able to argue with people who believe them, it's sometimes hard if you don't actually have the facts to argue with someone who is being like very dogmatic. So this book was just really, really useful to actually get a ton of statistics and true information that you can use as a rebuttal when you end up in an argument with someone who is using racist stereotypes. Again, this was a book that made me a bit teary. There were some sections that were very funny, there were some sections that were incredibly upsetting. Particularly, there is a section here on police brutality, and that is really, really hard to read, and the statistics are just mind-blowingly awful. It's also interesting to get a different perspective on some of the stereotypes that we have, because we might know, for example, that a stereotype that says that black men are aggressive, we know that that is dangerous. Whereas something like a stereotype that black people are good dancers, it's harder to see why that would be a dangerous stereotype. And so this book really gave me a different perspective on why all of these stereotypes are incredibly harmful. Especially if you look at where they came from. They all came from really damaging places. A book that I actually don't have physically because I borrowed it from one of my colleagues is Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. So this book was super, super hyped a few years ago. Loads of people were talking about it, and loads of people fucking hated it, but a lot of people loved it. I loved it. I really, really did. It was very divisive, and I get why some people didn't like it, but I was so into it. This book was kind of famous for being non-fiction that read like fiction, and it really did. I know people say that sometimes about books. I've said it about books like Maud West, for example, that kind of reads like fiction, but it's still very much, you can tell that it's non-fiction. Whereas Three Women, I'm not even sure I believe that it is non-fiction. Like, I'm sure she interviewed some women and found out their stories to base this on, but she essentially just wrote a novel about these women's lives. It did not seem like a piece of non-fiction writing at all, which is maybe why I liked it so much. So it's basically just 3 different stories, completely separate, no overlaps, just that they are all about women living very different lives. And I think one of the reasons people didn't like it is it's kind of pitched about being about female desire, but it's actually these very upsetting stories that aren't really about female desire. So there is one woman whose husband wants them to be in an open relationship, so it's kind of about her dealing with that. There is one woman who is recovering from having been abused by a teacher and not being believed about that. And then there is one woman who is in a very unhappy marriage and is having an affair. And all of them are very sad, particularly the second 2 of those I found really sad. So yeah, it is not an empowering book about female desire at all, but it is a book that really sucked me in. I really felt like I got to know these women throughout the course of the book and really, really felt for them. The one who was having an affair particularly, she was just the saddest character. She was so desperate to be loved, and this man that she was having an affair with, who was her high school ex-boyfriend, so clearly gave not a shit about her, and she just could not see that, and it broke my heart. I gave this book 5 stars, Just Eat It by Laura Thomas. This is a book all about eating and disordered eating and the ways in which so many of us do not have our shit together around food. It says on the front here. And I loved it. It really struck a chord because, yes, of course, I am also stuck in that mentality that we have all been raised in of just not ever thinking that my body is good enough in any way and being cross with myself all the time. And I found reading this book just so truthful. There's this book, and there's also, do I have it down here? There's a second one that Laura Thomas wrote called How to Just Eat It, which I'm kind of slowly working my way through, which is more of a guidebook to how to implement this stuff being intuitive eating and like getting away from diet culture. And what I really like about it is that Laura Thomas is so gentle and understanding and accepting with you, or encourages you to feel that way towards yourself. She doesn't say that you shouldn't be swept up in all this diet bullshit. She explains why it's harming you. She explains why it's happened. But she also acknowledges that a lot of us have lived decades of our life with all of this diet culture around us. We're not going to just click our fingers and overnight not subscribe to any of it. It's going to take time to help ourselves get out of it. And I really liked that gentle approach. She doesn't hold you to any impossible standards, because that's the point. We've all been held to these impossible standards our whole lives, and so sometimes the downsides of the body positive movement, when it's applied wrongly, can be just to make us feel even more shit about ourselves, because it's like, okay, your body doesn't look right and also your brain isn't feeling right, so you're just failing on both counts. And this book really avoided any of that. I have not escaped from diet culture yet, but this book does make it seem possible. Then I have a graphic novel, a non-fiction graphic novel. Is it still called a graphic novel if it's non-fiction? This is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is a story of... So Art Spiegelman is the son of a Holocaust survivor, and in Mouse he tells his father's story. In this book, the Jews are portrayed as mice and the Nazis are portrayed as cats. There are a few other animals as well of different nationalities, and that goes some way to making the imagery in here less horrific to look at, but it still feels scarily human. This is not an easy book to read, but it was absolutely fantastic. And there are layers in here, so it jumps back and forth between telling the story of Spiegelman's father, but also in the present day looking at his relationship with his father now, which is really difficult. And his father is not an easy person to get along with, and some of the things that were really interesting were, for someone who survived such a horrific human act of cruelty and was discriminated against for just being the person that they were, in this case being Jewish, his father is racist. So having survived the Holocaust, having made it out of a concentration camp, years later he doesn't want his son to pull over and pick up a black hitchhiker because he doesn't trust black people, and they have this argument about it, and it's so uncomfortable. But it is really interesting to be confronted with this fact that even having been so discriminated against himself, it doesn't necessarily make him not a person who can discriminate against other people. The book has 2 volumes. It was originally published separately, so he published volume 1 and then his father died, which obviously had a huge effect on him, and you can really see in volume 2 that it feels quite different, and you can see the anger and grief and confusion that the whole second volume is laced with. So yeah, I found this so moving. Quite like to read it again, actually. While we're talking about graphic novels, I also gave 5 stars to this one, Persepolis by Marjane and Satrapi. So this is the story of the author's childhood in Iran. And then during the Islamic Revolution, her parents sent her to Europe, to where they thought she would be safer. She moved around a few different countries in Europe, and then later on, as a young adult, she returned back to Iran. And so it's all about the different culture shocks that she faces moving around and trying to reconcile her sense of identity and home with the values that are so important to the author and to her family. So it's also about the huge contrasts between her private life at home and her public life while they're living in Iran. It's quite funny at points, it's really tragic at other points, and it does a really interesting job of telling this country's history through a very personal story. I've got Eating Animals here by Jonathan Safran Foer. This was the book that made me go vegan. I'm not currently vegan. I did stop being vegan. I was vegan for about 10 months and then I had to stop because I was having various health issues and it was too confusing trying to balance everything at once. And now I could go back to being vegan, but I just haven't because it was really hard. However, I would like to do it again one day, and I know if I read this book again I will do it again, because the second I read this I instantly just stopped wanting to eat any animal products at all. This book is fantastic, and it's not... I know I just said this is the book that made me turn vegan and blah blah. It's actually not this like harsh polemic on why you should be vegan at all. The author himself isn't even vegetarian throughout the book. He changes his diet a lot. This is kind of his quest to decide what he wants to eat. Triggered specifically by when he has a son, it feels very important to him to know more about the food that he is feeding to his child. So he sets out on this journey to discover more about where the food that he eats comes from. And what he discovers, a lot of it is pretty gross. It looks at the animal cruelty aspect of things. It also looks at the health issues, the economic effects. It's really far-reaching, and I mean honestly there are so many reasons why we should not be eating animal products, but the book is not trying to guilt you or anything like that at all. I feel like the only argument he really wants to get across to you is that you should know more about where the food is coming from that you put into your body. He doesn't want to convince you a certain way about what choices you make with that information, just kind of urging you that you should know, which is fair enough. Hey look, there's a train ticket in here. Taking Me to Brighton, May 2019. Lovely. This is the kind of non-fiction book that is usually what I mean when I say I don't like non-fiction. It's got very small writing and it's just full of facts. It looks like a textbook, but it doesn't read like a textbook. It was very engaging. The last book that I found I had given 5 stars to, you might laugh at me, was this one. This is How Stella Learned to Talk. My proof copy says How Hippo Learned to Talk. I feel like I was biased in why I gave this one 5 stars because I got very, very excited that Hippo was going to learn to talk, but also because it was really good. It was really, really interesting. It's partly a book about how you can teach your dog to talk, and it's partly a story about this author, Christina Hunger, figuring out that she could teach her dog to talk through the work that she does with children with speech difficulties, with communication difficulties. She found there are ways for those methods to overlap, and then through that you just get to learn a lot about her job, about her work with children, and I found that absolutely fascinating as well. I did instantly go out and buy all the kit. Hippo hasn't learnt to talk yet. I keep trying. I still press the buttons every time she goes outside, every time I give her food, every time we go for a walk, I press the buttons. So far, she's completely uninterested, but she is a particularly stupid dog. I also picked up 4 more books here that I didn't give 5 stars to, but I do just really remember loving, so I thought I would pick them up and show them to you as well. This is a collection of love letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, and it was beautiful, and their love was fantastic. Vita Sackville-West is one of my idols. I grew up near Sissinghurst Castle, where she lived, and I loved her then when I was a child because we used to go and visit her castle and the gardens and they were really pretty and we would have picnics there, so I always just remembered being like, cool, thanks Vita Sackville-West. No one told me she was a lesbian. That would have been very exciting if I'd known that. In retrospect, it was pretty obvious because they have her writing desk like kept preserved as it was, and she just has a picture of Virginia Woolf on it. I don't have a framed picture of any of my platonic friends on my desk, so in retrospect that was obvious. I say she's a lesbian, that's very bio-raising of me. Both of these women appear to be bisexual. It's not a word that I think they used about themselves at the time, but they both do love men and women throughout this. So this book starts in 1922 and it ends in 1941. So it spans basically 20 years from when they first meet all the way up until Virginia Woolf very tragically took her own life. And it's incredibly emotional. They wrote really, really beautiful letters to each other. So I loved that. Transitions are stories of being trans. I read this one quite recently. It was a very quick read. It's just a collection of essays from different trans authors about their different daily experiences, and I really liked how broad it was. Some of them did talk about the daily struggles of being trans, but a lot of them felt like they were celebrating the experience of being trans, and so that was a lovely perspective that I haven't seen talked about as much. So I really enjoyed this as a little window into learning more about the trans experience, or the trans experiences that exist. The Argonauts by Maggie Smith. I can't remember that much about this book now because it's been years since I read it, but I do remember I was surprised how much I liked it because it's quite a dense book. I read this one shortly after I finished my women's studies course, and at that point I was so bored of reading like academic writing that I picked this one up and then was like, oh no, I can't do this. And then I just loved it. It's a lot of musings on Maggie Nelson's life, her relationship with her partner, who is fluidly gendered, her relationship with motherhood, and her body during pregnancy and motherhood. It's about their creating a queer family together, and it is very philosophical, but I didn't find it inaccessible, and I thought I would. So if you think you will, maybe give it a go. And then finally, As You Wish, this book, I feel like I actually should upgrade it to a 5-star read because I loved it so much. This is a behind-the-scenes story of them making the film The Princess Bride. I probably didn't give it 5 stars because it probably wasn't actually that good. It was just joyful to read because I love that movie and it sounded like they had such a great time filming it. When it got to the end where they finished filming and they all have to say goodbye, I honestly think I felt as sad reading that bit as when I left school. And I felt very sad leaving school because I loved my school. The book is written by Cary, who plays Wesley, and he is handsome, which is important. We do also get little snippets of quotes from other actors and people on the crew, so you get quite a well-rounded picture. There's just loads of really good anecdotes in here. It was a delight. If you like that film, this is fantastic. Look at them. So cute. And he is handsome. Might just look at these pictures for a while. So there you go. It turns out I do actually really like non-fiction. Who knew? So if you have any non-fiction recommendations for me, leave them in the comments below and I might read them. Haven't decided yet. I'm going to sit here and read this again though. So with that, see you next time.